Looking for so shall I begin then?
Yes, ma'am.
Good evening, everybody.
Good evening, ma'am.
And I don't know, I may have ruined your Sunday also, because and that too in the evening, maybe the earlier part of the day would have been convenient, but it would have been slightly inconvenient for me. That's the reason. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am, you are.
I got it shifted to the evening slot. So today we shall go directly to the essay, and because last time I basically introduced you to the work of Judith Butler, her entire work, that is Gender Trouble, the introduction that is there to her book Gender Trouble, and now we shall come straight to the first chapter, that is actually the essay that is or the part that is prescribed for you all. So to see her work, the first chapter, that is the subjects of sex, gender, and desire. If you see the little editor's introduction, I'll just spell out a few points that is of value and which will keep us focused in understanding the talk or the lecture. So the introduction says that Judith Butler's work belongs to a philosophy or feminist theory, because you know that she works within feminist theory, and of course from a very philosophical point. She makes a philosophical inquiry into the entire category of woman. So it is within the feminist theory. She is in fact she actually critiques feminist theory or the positions from which they speak, and she develops her arguments by way of working on two key feminists. Okay, so her work is she goes on to work further from what they had already stated earlier. So one is the two key feminists that she works on are French feminist philosophers Simone de Beauvoir. You're all familiar with her, The Second Sex, and you know that she is essentially an existentialist. She was writing during the 1940s and 1950s, and often she is considered the first modern feminist thinker. Okay, and she actually takes off from her statements in The Second Sex, where she talks about where a woman, one is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman. And the next feminist that she works on, a French feminist, is Luz Irigaray. She's a post-structuralist, and she was mainly writing during the 1970s. So these are the two feminists that she works on. So she starts off from the division that Beauvoir makes on sex and gender. And in the case of Luz Irigaray, she looks at how she works on the language, when the issue of language or within feminist theory. So Butler provides an abstract conceptual framework. Okay, so she works through this conceptual framework. And if you look at her stance, where does she draw her ideas from? Last class also we mentioned that she draws her ideas largely from Foucault, Michel Foucault. So she is Foucauldian in that she argues that all social and legal regulations which seem to the way society is regulated, the way the legal, laws, the laws are made, the legal regulations are made. They seem to limit freedom actually, but actually they also provide the conditions for identities in freedom, in which freedom becomes meaningful and desirable. So it's not just because she does see those systems as limiting, prohibiting, which offers restrictions, but at the same time, they also provide conditions for, where the for the identities where freedom, it makes sense to talk about freedom, and that freedom is desirable. So this is mainly because initially when you see the first part of the essay, she talks about the Foucault's ideas on the judicial system. Next, she is also Freudian. She draws her ideas from Freud. For she talks about the desires, the drives, the identities that are not simply, social constructions. Because usually when we talk about gender, taking off from Beauvoir, we often talk about how, gender is a construct. But she goes on also to talk about how issues of, how desires, drives, identity, they are not simply, social constructions. They also belong to the body, okay, which is not quite, so it is not always quite the creative of, it's not created because of ideological or other familial structures. So something that is there in the body also. So not just everything is a construct, but there are something which belongs to the body. Okay, so issues of desires, drives, and identities. And she gives the example of especially the same-sex desire. So it is not just that it is all, constructed socially or culturally constructed, but also the same-sex desire belongs to the body. And it may depend as to where this desire for the same sex, it may take place anywhere, it may gain definition or force anyway. So it is, it is not spelled out beforehand as to where this, it belongs to which body or where it will manifest itself. Okay, so this is one, so she, let's say, discusses when it comes to the issue of same-sex desire. Then she is also a deconstructionist. Okay, deconstructionist because she breaks down the binaries in her arguments. She does not want to. She does not argue on the basis of binaries, seeing everything in terms of binaries: the masculine, the feminine, the sex, and the body. So breaking masculine and the feminine. So she breaks down these binaries, because when we talk about feminism, it is always in terms of the feminine versus the masculine, okay, male versus the female, nature, culture, these binaries that are there. So the nature, nurture, so these are the binaries that she breaks down, because the deconstruction all do not speak in terms of binaries, but they believe in deconstructing these binaries. So essentially the essay is a critique of the notion the people, the notion the people necessarily have of one of the two genders. Okay, so she makes a critique of the notions that people have of either the masculine or the feminine. And also, as I said, as she breaks down these, talks about breaking down the binary, she also critiques that why have a limit, why have to limit one's choice either to the masculine or the feminine, or why having to choose one or the other, or let's say, why choose between nature, as she says, nature and nurture, okay, what you're born with and that against what you're supposed to be. So why always see in terms of these binaries. So these this is, let's say, the platform from where she works. With these ideas, she goes on to make her arguments in the essay. Now, coming to the first part of the essay, where she talks about the women as the subject of feminism. So, according to her, she begins by saying that feminist theory assumes that there is some existing identity. There's always this category of women, because they take it for granted. It's as though we know, okay, if the feminists are arguing, they take it for granted that there is a category or a group of people who we identify or call them as women. Okay. So it is understood through this category of women. And the feminist theory basically work towards the interests, towards a feminist interests and goals. So it is keeping in mind. So they get taken for granted that there is this category that we call women, whose let's say they work in their interests and goals. So it is, so as though this is taken for granted, or you accept that there is this category, what we call the woman. So feminists, pursue the interest and goals within this discourse. But at the same time, when they talk about, now what Butler points out is when feminist theorists, when they talk about women and talk about feminist interests and goals, what they do is at the same time, while talking about pursuing feminist goals and interests, they at the same time also constitute the subject for whom they want basically political representation. Because, feminists basically engage with issues of power. So that is feminist theorists. They, while talking about pursuing of feminist interests and goals, they at the same time also constitute the subject. They also constitute the categories. So, it's not just talking about them, at the same time constitute or produce, let's say constitute the subject of woman for whom they talk about political representation, or for whom the political representation is pursued. So first she begins, because she's going to now talk about how this is linked, how the representation happens, and how this has to do with, and what is the politics behind this, okay, and how they are related. So now politics and representation, according to Butler, are very controversial terms, because, feminist theories, theorists, when they talk about these issues, raise these issues, they essentially do it for political representation. Now she says that now these are very controversial terms, both politics and representation, that Butler talks about. Now she says, now within a political process, in any political process, she says now, she first tries to explain the word representation. Now what do we mean by representation? Because, whenever we talk about politics and representation, when we talk about political leaders, we talk about they being as representatives of people, So similarly, she says that within a political process, the term representation means basically giving visibility and legitimacy to women as political subjects. So when they talk about according to Butler, when we talk about what she interprets is, when we talk about representation, or when feminists talk about political representation or representation, one let's say interpretation is that of basically giving women visibility. Okay, so there is this category of women, and they are to be recognized and they are to be given representation. Hence they, in a way, that is a way of granting legitimacy to women as political subjects. So here they are women and they ought to be given political representation. So what is happening? They are being given visibility, and at the same time, it is a legitimizing of this category that we call women as political subjects. Now there is the other interpretation. On the other hand, what she says, that representation is also a normative function of language. Okay, meaning which is when we talk about representation of something, when we in language, meaning basically talking about something as a norm, representation. When we talk about representation of women in cinema, let's say. So what we see is, or let's say, that it also includes what we call the normative. That means it is said to either reveal or distort, the idea of the woman. So what is assumed to be, true about the category of women. So when we talk about women, so when we, let's say, language ki baat karte, when it comes to language, let's say, people may use words like, okay, a woman should be this, kind, warm-hearted, sweet, whatever, or in language, you see, these are some of the words that kind of represent women. Or maybe the other way also around, but you see that they may not always, be exactly right. The representation may be distorted. Sometimes they may exactly reveal that yes, women are like this. Sometimes it may actually go against what is being, or the way it is being represented. So such kind of representation in language can either be revealing or it can distort the representation of women. Okay, so so um, so so having discussed these two, the groups, or these two, let's say, interpretations of representation, she says that for feminist theory, the development of language, okay, like it is important that how a language is, or she talks about how a language develops so that it fully or adequately represents women. So there is a need to develop, there must be a development. I mean, for feminist theory, like all feminist theory talk about a language that should completely and adequately or fully, represent women, as seem necessary. So, so why? So they can foster a political visibility of women. So talking about, let's say, how women can be made more politically visible. So there must be a language that, or need to develop a language that kind of completely represents them. Okay, that's okay. All, so that, when we utter the word, all kinds of women are included within that category. So feminist theories talk about in such terms, because this is what Butler begins by first stating the position of the feminist theories. So she first begins by what feminist theories do, okay, how do they talk, what is their argument, and later on she will go on to counter their arguments or to critique their statements. So she says that this is what feminist theory does. It also talks about the development of language, which is all encompassing, which will kind of, represent women adequately so that it can foster political visibility of women. Now, this is important. Why is this important? Because you know that in almost all cultures, women's lives are either misrepresented or not represented. Because actually, again, she says that we need to also look at, when we talk about the category of women, are women of all cultures adequately represented when we talk about the category of women? Who are these women? Are they these white women? Does that include black women? Does South Asian women or other women? So, and again, the whole ideas of class, race, ethnicity are all that included when we talk about the category of women. Okay, so you see, so when she becomes and that is why she begins with this. So even when we talk about the development of a language, so that it represents women adequately, does that include all cultures, women's lives, where there may be cultures where either it is misrepresented or not represented at all. So now the prevailing conception, she goes on to say that the relation between feminist, because so far we have been talking about feminist theory, how it talks about political representation, and even within representation, how it posits or brings up the category of woman. Now the prevailing conception that is there, between feminist theory and politics, according to Butler, has now been challenged. This relation between feminist theory and politics. This has come under severe criticism within feminists, especially of course, when at the time of writing a book, Gender Trouble, this was being challenged, that the relation between feminist theory and politics, from and this was being questioned from within feminist discourse. So she was working within feminist theory, and it is within that she critiques this relation of feminist theory and politics. So she first begins by questioning that how viable is this subject. Okay, this, when they talk about feminist theory, talks about this category of woman, how viable is this subject? is that the subject, that is the category, the whole the category of woman that they talk about, how viable is this subject, and how this subject of woman that is constituted uh, can be said to be the ultimate candidate for representation or liberation. That has to be questioned, because remember, when we within politics, it is, what is the politics about? To talk about representation, so that ultimately they may be granted emancipation, so that the emancipation of the woman can happen. But this woman that feminist theories talk about, how viable is the subject? Is that subject that of woman, the category of woman, is that the ultimate candidate, that for whom the representation has to be done, of whom, for whom the liberation has to be, spoken about? Is that the ultimate candidate? So the question is about this woman, the category of woman that is, that feminist theory talk about. Now, how is that, as I said, the ultimate candidate or the viable, the viable subject? Now, also there is very little agreement on, so who constitutes or ought to constitute the category. So, okay, fine. If, because as I said, when you talk about women, which women are we talking about? Who are these women? The white women, the black women, the South Asian women, or some from other cultures, some cultures that even we may not be aware of. So who's this woman that constitute this category of women? So the question arises that what are the qualifications for being a subject? What qualifies as being a subject or a woman? Okay, so that first must be met before any representation can be extended. So if woman has to be granted representation within politics, okay, they're talking about representation, political representation of women. So if representation has to be granted to this woman, what qualifications must this woman meet in order to get representation? Okay, so what qualifications? So how do you decide? Okay, so and so is a woman, the category of woman, not just that is of course the one aspect that she also explores, but this woman, who do you describe? Do you describe a person with certain features, a body with certain organs, and so, okay, this woman, or a person with long hair and a particular features, or a particular way of behavior, a way of conducting herself? You describe. What about a woman, or let's say, who looks boyish, does not have long hair, or let's say even physically features may not also to some extent qualify, but yet is womanly? Would that categorize as a woman? So you see, she is now problematizing the category of woman. So who would qualify to be called a woman? Okay, so she begins that in the, what are the qualifications for being a subject? That has to be first met before representation can be. So when they talk about representation, that means they are also talking about constituting a subject as to who would qualify as a woman, who has to be granted representation. So if one fulfills the qualification of being a woman, then the representation can be extended to this woman. So she begins with first raising questions about this whole category, the so-called category of woman, and what are the qualifications, or who would qualify to be called a woman. Okay. Then she goes on to talk about the judicial system that Foucault talks about. Okay, because now she will talk about a system of power, a judicial system, which is a system of power, and that how that system of power constitutes the subject of woman. So according to Foucault, and judicial is basically anything relating to the administration of justice or the office of a judge, anything to do with social legal regulations, okay, to do with justice. So according to Foucault, the judicial system produces the subject they subsequently come to represent. So according to Foucault, the judicial system actually first constitutes the subject, and then they talk about giving representation to this subject. So remember, the feminist theory, feminist theory talks about the representation of this woman. But what, according to Foucault, is how the system first constitutes the subject and then talks about. So you see, the idea that first there's a system of power which constitutes the subject, and then it talks about giving representation to that system, to that subject. So first you constitute, you decide. So you see what it is, what Butler tries to point out: a system of power, a hegemonic system, which first decides as to, you create first, I mean you constitute, you decide that what kind of a subject needs to be produced. A system which decides as to what kind of a subject should be produced, and then you decide to give emancipation, or you decide to give, I mean, representation to that subject, and then talk about its emancipation. So so according to Foucault, now this judicial system of power not just constitutes who a woman is, but it also goes on to talk about, okay, it also goes to talk about like who a woman is. Okay, so not just talking about let's say constituting a subject, but also who a woman is. So they first of all produce that, and it is that system which decides who a woman is. So what she's trying to expose by using Butler using Foucault's idea is, you see, a system that first constitutes and then decides what should be, who this subject should be, or what should constitute this subject. So the idea is that if juridical formation of language and politics that represents woman as the subject of feminism, and how does this get constituted? How does this subject get constituted? We know that according to Foucault, it is through the discourses. It is the discourses that constitute the subject. Okay, so it is a formation. It is a discursive formation. The formation of the subject. We're talking about the constitution of the subject, or the formation of this is constituted through discourses, to certain ideas, talks, which produces this idea of the subject. And then what happens is that first it is that discourses that produce that this is what, or this is what this woman is. That is why it says the subject. Okay, and then the effect of a given version of formation, and it has the effect of a version of representation for this, meaning it first constitutes, produces, and then it tries to give, it gives representation. So it gives the effect that it is giving representation to a category. Okay, they are being now represented. But what is being pointed out is that first that subject has been already constituted, and then you give the impression is given that they are being given representation. Okay, so there is this effect of a given version of representational politics. So the feminist subject turns out to be discursively constituted. So you see the feminist subject. How has the feminist subject now been constituted or produced? It is through these discourses. Okay, and this discourses is very much by the very political system. That is, again, it is the same political system that will again facilitate its emancipation. So first you constitute the subject. It is the system that has constituted through discourse. The formation of the subject has taken place, and now what is being done? It is that same system now that will work towards facilitating its emancipation. So it will work towards giving it emancipation. So first it constitutes, and it's the same system again. It is within that same system that again this emancipation is to be given. So okay, so what Butler points out is that to expect such a system for emancipation of women will be clearly self-defeating, because it is this system which has decided what the subject will be. I mean, which has constituted, which has itself produced that subject, and then talks about giving it emancipation, giving it freedom, talking about freedom. So isn't it self-defeating? I mean, it is first the system of power, the judicial system of power or system of power. It first constitutes, and then it talks about giving emancipation. So according to, Butler, she points out this is absolutely self-defeating, because to expect that same system which has constituted it to give it emancipation, it does hardly, what's the point in talking about giving emancipation to a subject which itself it has created, okay, or constituted. So a judicial system that constitutes or produces a subject and then gives representation for emancipation. According to Butler, Butler actually questions such a system. Okay, the system she puts, she raises questions about this system itself, the judicial system. So of course she uses Foucault's idea. So she raises questions about this, about such a system, the system that first constitutes, produces the subject, and then talks about giving it. Okay. Okay, so we'll continue. So you see, hence the question of the subject is crucial for politics. Okay, because it is all about the constitution, because she's already pointed out how this judicial system constitutes the subject. So you see, the question of the subject is very crucial for politics and for feminist politics in particular. So when feminist theory talks about politics and representation of political representation of women, the issue of the subject becomes very crucial for feminist politics. Why? Because judicial subjects are invariably produced. Now, what is the issue? Why is this a problem? Because Butler points out that, as Foucault mentions, that these subjects are always produced through certain exclusionary practices. Okay, certain exclusionary practices, such as a system which tries to restrict, leave out, limits. It works through limitation. It leaves out certain thing. It regulates. So it works through exclusionary practices, because the political construction of the subject always proceeds with certain exclusionary aims. It decides that it must leave out this, or it must only legitimate this. So what the system decides that uh, who is who would be a legitimate woman, or who the system decides about legitimizing this category. Okay, so so it works with certain legitimating and exclusionary aims. So that is why she critiques this judicial system, because or why the constitution of the subject through such a system needs to be critiqued, because the system always works through exclusionary. It tries to leave out certain categories, certain groups, certain people. So if they constitute a subject, they leave out certain people, certain groups, or they legitimize this is what, or this is only what should constitute, and the political operation are, and how they do it, the way it works, the way this legitimizing, or the exclusionary way in which it works is often concealed. We do not come to see it. We do not see that how these groups or these people have been left out. Okay, or what is what is accepted as what is natural, what is normal. remember we were talking about heteronormative relations. So how it leaves out certain other kind of relations, or other groups. So you see, it does not really reveal as to what it leaves out, and what is posited often after some time appears as something very natural. Okay, and so it conceals and naturalizes, and is naturalized basically by a political analysis. And this is how the judicial structures work. And that is how, in fact, it also legitimizes its own position. Okay, it is that is how it justifies its ways of working, is how it operates. So the judicial power, that is how it produces what it, let's say, produces. What it claims it's only just represents, because it claims to represent. But you see, what is more important is how the system produces, how it constitutes the subject. That needs to be looked at, not so much about how it it talks about representation. So politics must be concerned, as Butler points out, is that politics must be concerned with the dual function of power. Okay, what is the dual function of power? That the judicial system and the production. Okay, and the judicial system and the meaning how the law produces. Okay, so when we look at the function of power, so look at the function of the system, the judicial system. And when we look at the how the what is the function of, how does this power function, you see the politics. One is that it is how it produces the subject. And apart from that, what it does, it also conceals how the subject is produced before the law, meaning how that subject is regulated. So one, it produces the subject, and it also hides or conceals how that subject is produced, okay, before the law, meaning how that subject gets, let's say, regulated by that system. So how it produces, and how it conceals the way it works, how its operations work, how it produces the subject before the law. And this, what does it do in the process? It legitimizes the law's own regulatory hegemony, meaning it legitimizes its power. So the system that produces this subject, it also hides the way it produces this subject, meaning what is left out, it does not let me accept it as something natural. And what it does in the process, it actually legitimizes its own function, its own power, its own hegemonic position, that it is in a position of control, it dominates. Okay, so it legitimizes its own self, this entire system. So the question arises, so where is the problem? So what is the problem? So problem is that it is not enough to inquire how women might become more fully represented in language and politics. Okay, because that is what Butler's argument is, that the feminist theory, they talk about talking, they keep themselves focused on talking about this category of women, how their representation can be fully developed in language, so that more groups of women, more categories or more kinds of women are included within this category of women in language and in politics. So the problem is not enough to talk about because if you look at feminist theories, if you've been studying, if you've been reading, we remember the phase when this entire feminist movement started. So first, initially, there's this category of the women, and talking about women's empowerment, emancipation, and this. So later on, at a later phase, you find criticism coming in from the Black feminists. They say that the woman that is being spoken about is essentially the white European female. It is not, they do not talk about representation of the Black women, because their issues, their concerns, their their cultures are different. So how does that kind of the category of women that the so-called white feminists talk about, how far do they actually adequately represent other groups of women. Then the same applies to the third world women. How can the first world women actually talk about the interests of the third world women? And similarly, how about South Asian? So you see, so initially the idea was to keep expanding this category of women to include as many women both in language and in politics. But what Butler does is, she actually begins by, she this is the critique that she talks about, I mean, this is how she critiques the feminist position. And according to her, the feminist critique, they also ought to understand how the category of women, the subject of feminism, is also produced and restrained by the key structures of powers through which emancipation is sought. So what her idea is to actually understand, one needs to look at first the category of woman itself, how not talk about expanding that category or talk about its representation also in language, but rather talk about how this category itself gets produced. Okay, the category of woman gets produced, and to talk about the structures of power, that constitutes or produces this category of woman, and for which emancipation is spoken about. According to her, that she discusses is that in that case, what happens is, when you talk about all these various who is this woman in this category, so-called woman, then she says that means somewhere there is a possibility of also talking about that maybe there is this called the woman that we're talking about. Maybe she takes a very radical stand. She's saying maybe there is no such idea or category that we can talk about is the woman, and this is probably only fictive. Okay, so according to her, so she says that you never know, that it could just be a fiction, and the woman, so-called what we assume to be the woman, or who we could say qualifies for being a woman, may just be a trace. She says just be a trace of the idea or the state of the nature, hypothesis, that that she says that all these foundationists, they talk about such categories. So so the woman that is produced before the law, remember, say she's the category of woman that is now produced by the system and is also produced before the law. She's saying maybe there is no such category of the woman that we think it is there. Okay, so these could be absolutely fictive, and there is this this problem about this entire category. So she raises questions about this, the whole idea of this category, not just the category of woman. So is there in that case a stable category of women? Okay, now she moves on to this idea that can we really say that there is a very stable idea of a woman? Okay, is it really there? I mean, can we really talk about a common women's identity? Okay, is there something called a term women which denotes a common identity? This is common to all women. Can we say that? So when we talk about the category of women, can we say that yes, this woman is common to all women? All women are like that, or all women fit into that category. Okay, so she talks about the title of the book by Denise Riley. She says, "Am I that woman?" You see, so the question is thus produced the possibility that maybe am I that woman? Is the woman that they're talking about, do I really fit into that? Am I really that woman that the system is talking about, the system has produced or the system has constituted? Do I fit into that? Am I really that woman? So am I that name is the title of this work by Denise Riley. Okay, so the idea of a woman's common identity becomes problematic. You see, so it is not easy to say that yes, when we talk about the category of women, there is something which is common to all women, okay, or all women fit into this category. So now you see, she is kind of problematizing this entire category of woman, because according to her, because gender, again, she says, can never be very coherently or it can, the gender is not all, cannot be coherently or consistently constituted again in different historical contexts. Okay, so when we talk about even the category of women, seeing if you look at in different cultural contexts, you might find that it is not the same. Okay, so the different cultural historical context. Why? Because you see, the even the category of this woman, or when we talk about gender, you see it intersects with several other, just as I said, white women category being, I mean, the earlier whole idea of talking about women's rights are being contested by the black women. So you see, why is the difference? Because they speak from the point of race, because black women again have had to experience colonization at the hands of even white women. So you see, the issue of colonialism, the issue of racism comes up. So you see, so gender intersects with so many other things. Okay, so she talks about the intersectionality of gender, how gender intersects with race, class, ethnicity, sexual, and other regional modalities. So we cannot talk about one common category of a woman, because woman, marginalized woman, when Marshika Devi also talks about the subaltern woman. So, again, you see a woman who is, a Dalit, or, and from a marginalized section of that, would that woman also qualify to be in the category of, let's say, a white woman? So you see the difference. So, this has to be kept in mind. This has to be kept in mind, that how, when we are talking about gender, how that gender also has to take into account the issues of race, class, ethnicity, sexual, and other regional modalities. So how gender intersects with all of these other categories, other categories. So as a result, it almost becomes impossible to separate out gender from the political and cultural intersections in which it is always produced. So you see, even the constitution, when we talk about the constitution of this category of women, it cannot be one woman, or we cannot say yes, this is the woman, because it intersects with all of these other groups and categories. Okay, so, and it gets differently constituted in different cultural historical contexts. It's not the same. So to talk about the idea of a universal woman becomes a problem. It becomes problematic. So then she goes on to say, then is in that case, because when we talk about women's movement, and that is why, Judith Butler is also sometimes criticized, because according to the feminists, she kinds of, kind of pulls back the, the women's movement for rights or emancipation, because, she kind of problematizes the entire category. So you see, now if people start raising questions about this woman, which woman are you trying to talk about? Whose liberation? Okay, who are these women? If so then the question arises, which women are you talking about? Because often you may have seen that, okay, women may be talking about oppression and talking about patriarchal domination, but sometimes the question arises about these women as to who are these women, because these women who may be speaking may be from very privileged position and may not be actually experiencing those oppression. So so can we really talk about this category of can we talk about this idea of a universal woman? And is also there similarly a universal notion of patriarchy? So the next argument that she moves on to is, then is there a universal basis for women? Okay, is there something, a universal category of women? And similarly, is there a universal patriarchy? So these the feminists who talk about who argue for the case of women, okay, so they work with the assumption that there must be uh, a singular form of a woman, They work with the social. What she wants to point out is they work with the assumption that somewhere there is a singular, form of or idea of the woman, and similarly they may be also, a singular or a universal notion of patriarchy, meaning everywhere there must be the same system of male domination, and everywhere women may be oppressed. That means these feminists work with this idea that in that case, that means everywhere is the same with women, meaning everywhere they are oppressed and everywhere it is the male, it's the patriarchal domination. There is male domination. But again, she points out that such kind of feminist theorizing, where you except let's say look for illustrations of differences in culture and all. He says because they do talk about differences in culture, but let's say apart from seeing just differences in culture, he says, isn't it also true that such kind of feminist theorizing, what they essentially end up also doing is they when they create such ideas that there is a kind of a universal woman who's universally oppressed, and there is the entire patriarchal system out there which always oppresses everywhere. There is some form of patriarchal domination. When they work with this idea, when these feminists work with these ideas, she points out that this kind of feminist theorizing it has now come under severe criticism, and because what it does also, and why is it being criticized, is that maybe it also it is being criticized because it tries to also colonize and appropriate other non-Western, appropriate non-Western cultures to support Western notions of oppression. Because you may have come across, okay, in the West, women must be talking about this, but is it the same kind of oppression that you see in another culture? Is it the same? Does the same thing happen in another culture? Is it the same kind of domination that happens? Well, some may say yes, domination all over is the same. Feminists may argue, but some may say, does it happen everywhere? Is it the same everywhere in all other cultures? So feminist, such feminist theorization have to face this criticism that there is also this effort to appropriate other, what it does is it also appropriates other, other non-Western, let's say, notions of non-Western cultures, and this appropriation, meaning you take it for granted that the same kind of domination happening everywhere. This is essentially done to support highly Western notions of oppression, meaning it is basically done to support a particular idea of oppression, a particular notion of domination. And in the process, what they also do is that they also construct this a third world, or even an Orient, in which the gender oppression is also always explained in terms of being barbaric. It's a non-Western barbarism. That is how it is interpreted. In other words, even the feminists who kind of spearhead these movements, they somewhere it also works through a certain domination where it kind of appropriates other cultures to support its own particular view of oppression. कि ऐसे ही होता है oppression. It is like this everywhere. This is exactly how it happens everywhere. So it may be just done to support one particular idea of domination. So she criticizes such kind of feminist movements, and he says that the urgency of feminism to establish this universal patriarchy, universal status for patriarchy, to make their own feminist claims to be as representatives, has this has come under severe criticism. And he says that the whole idea of creating this category of women and to talk about such universal category of women or universal patriarchy, these are essentially fictive. I mean, it is not really true. And to talk in terms of a universal woman or a universal form of patriarchy, this has in fact actually produced this has led to a woman's common subjugated experience, that everywhere women have the same kind of subjugated. This has kind of produced this idea. So she kind of critiques the feminist arguments for a universal idea of a woman that is always oppressed, and a patriarchy that is always let's say dominating, or oppressive. And this in turn also, let's say, always produces this entire idea of a woman that is always has subjugated, a common subjugated experience. A woman's produces the idea of a woman's common subjugated experience. So then she says that, well, if one were to investigate into this, one would find that the whole idea of a universal patriarchy, it's no longer so credible to say that everywhere there is this patriarchal system and all that. It says, in fact, it has kind of it is no longer that credible. Well, he says that when it comes to the women of being oppressed, that is still accepted, but the idea of universal patriarchy being universal, and that has more or less kind of eroded, and it has lost a bit of its credibility. I mean, no one really accepts that this kind of domination is exactly the same everywhere. Okay, so this so there is this idea that there is still commonality among women still exists. And I mean, it is still, it is still let's say accepted that, okay, maybe there are cultures where women, or let's say generally everywhere in some form or the other, let's say women in different cultures, they are, they do come under a patriarchal system of domination. Or what she also believes, then, is it always in terms, this domination, does the domination always work in terms of the male, the patriarchal system dominating woman, or the male domination over woman? Is the nature of domination always between these two groups, or there are some other forms of cultural domination? You see, now you see, she now is trying to break down these binaries. Is it the same in, I mean, is it, or everywhere it is it male domination over female domination, or there is always this culture of masculine cultures dominating the feminine? Is it always in terms of these binaries? Do these nature of domination, are they the only kind of domination within any society, or within different cultures? Is the nature of domination always within these two binaries, within the masculine and the feminine? Okay, he's saying, now she says, now if that was the case, then if one were to look only within these two groups, it is always one, the masculine dominating the, that means, then what about, as she pointed out earlier, then what about the issues that we were talking about, the issues of, what happens, how does the subject get constituted when it comes to issues of class, race, ethnicity? How does then the category of the woman get constituted? So maybe one needs to look at, the other, there may be other culture, other, more dominant cultural formation. They may, and not, one need not always look in terms of the binaries, okay, of masculine and feminine. And he's saying this binaries automatically get decontextualized. When we always see in terms of these binaries, the masculine and the feminine, this also gets decontextualized, or let's say it does not really work out that way when again we see it in terms of, let's say, class, race, ethnicity, because it may differ. Okay, it may vary, it may not again be the same always, the domination working exactly like that. Okay, so then she arrives at the point. She says, my suggestion is that this, this presumed, so that means this idea of the universal woman, or even the idea of the universal patriarchy, more of the universal woman. She says this presumed universality and unity of the subject, okay, of the subject of feminism, okay, is therefore weakened. It gets undermined by the constraints of the representational discourse. When we talk about the representation of women, this whole idea of there being a universal woman, that gets weakened. Okay, so there is no stable category of women. So ultimately the point that she arrives at is that there is no such actually a stable subject of feminism, where that this which can be understood as a as a seamless category, that it's as if there are no problems within this category. Okay, so and because what she points out is that how can one so easily accept this category. So basically she tries to this destabilize this this what is generally accepted as the stable category of a woman. And what one needs also to see that how the system that constitutes the so-called stable category of woman, okay, how these work through certain how they create how do they regulate uh, uh, the subject, and how what is excluded, okay, in the construction or in the constitution of the category of woman. What are the what is being left out, what are the exclusionary practices, and what is being left out. So what she suggests, that what feminism does, that it seeks a wider represent. What feminism has done often is that they seek a wider representation for a subject, which again it itself constructs. um, uh, because she began with that critique, so she tries to come towards her argument, that you see the problem is that while it talks about that woman, the constitution of this category of woman is always within that particular system, and to expect that system for the emancipation of women is is definitely is self-defeating, and how far that actually works. But as feminists have argued, like you may have heard of the term strategic essentialism that Gayatri Spivak speaks of, that in order to for feminists to argue for its own goals and interests, for to argue for its greater representation, there is a need to form the category of woman. Otherwise, how do you fight for your rights as a group? How do you talk about representation? And sometimes there is a need to, it may be problematic, that there is a need to accept this category of woman for strategic purpose. Because why? Because you want that certain certain your interests are further, certain goals are arrived at. So she talks about what she calls strategic essentialism. So sometimes it can be used, and they defend their position is that it is merely for strategic purposes that this has to be done, because otherwise how else do you fight for the rights of a woman, or how else do you talk about the representation of women if you do not accept the category of woman? Because in that case, if you refuse the category of woman, then to talk about women's interests, to talk about its in the feminist goals or interests, that would never work out. But again, what Butler points out, that often, though it works, it initially begins with this intention, but it actually does not go on to actually do that. Okay, it may sometimes, it exceeds the purpose for which they were initially intended. So it does not really work for a limited mill, because the idea is that, okay, it is there for a limited phase till those demands are met. So you posit the, or you accept this category of woman. But according to Butler, sometimes this, the purpose for which such category is accepted, sometimes, it exceeds the purpose for which they were initially intended. Okay. So then she says that then gradually, after having pointed out, however, after having critiqued all of these, the stance of on the stance of the feminist stance, or the the position from which feminist theory had been speaking so far. Her argument has often been categorized, hence, because she is critiquing feminist theory. She's critiquing what had been going on within feminist discourse. So Butler's stand and or her, her let's say intervention, at this juncture of what we can call cultural politics, is a period that has often been called the phase of post-feminist. Hence, Butler is often referred to as a post-feminist, or with her begins what is also called the third phase of feminism. Okay, because you see, she begins by questioning the entire category of women. She talks about how the subject of the woman gets constructed, what is the system of power that works in producing that subject, how does that subject get constituted, and so and how the construction works through certain exclusionary practices, how it tries to leave out certain groups of people, how it leaves out or legitimizes or accepts as legitimate only certain kind of women as, or within the category of women. Okay, so she begins and to kind of critique the entire feminist stance. And so then she, after having critiqued all of this position, now from there on, she moves on to talk about, takes off from the ideas of Simone de Beauvoir. From here now, her argument begins about, she says, why not, we have, I mean, the feminists have always accepted woman as a stable category, the stable notion of gender, after having raised or critiqued the stable idea or category of woman. Now she goes on to talk about, let's say, um, uh, what has been, how the idea of, this gets constructed, because this, I mean, the construction or the how the subject of the woman gets constituted. She looks at his genealogy, and then she goes on to the ideas of Simone de Beauvoir. So she now begins with how initially the idea of Beauvoir, where she begins with, and she says that when she had spoken about, making a segregation between, I mean, making a distinction, not segregation, making a distinction between sex and gender. So, she says that what Beauvoir has stated, or what also gets implied, she works on that. So she says she begins by making this distinction. Her contribution is that she begins by making this distinction between sex and gender. So according to Beauvoir, as we know that she sees sex as the biologically given, and gender as being culturally constructed. And from here on, she goes on to argue that it is not just, that, because now she goes on to talk about the constructedness, because having accepted the constructedness of gender, because remember Simone de Beauvoir in her well-known book, The Second Sex, how she talks about that, how gender is culturally constructed. Okay, so where the sex refers to the, the male body or the female body, okay, the biological given, but one born as a, with a male body is kind of socialized into, having, or must be having, or he is kind of culturally constructed. The whole notion of gender, the masculine gender gets, it's a social and cultural constructor. So the how the gender gets constructed, so as a and how the socializing takes place, socialization of this body takes place, where one with the born with the male body is automatically, I mean, within the culture, social and cultural construct. It's supposed to conform to how a boy or a male should behave, or born with a male body should behave. Okay, so the constructedness of gender being a construct, that is what she had emphasized. As you know that how the socialization takes place. So a person born with a female body, as she grows up, she has to conform. She is made to conform to how a woman should behave. Okay, as she says, the one is not born a woman, but one becomes a woman. So she must there are certain rules or regulations imposed. So this is how she must conduct herself, this is how she must behave herself, this is how she must be, all these other social rules that apply to her, because she is born with this female body. And similarly for the male, that because he's a male born with because he's born with a male body, male sexual organs, so he must again conform to certain masculine traits, masculine characteristic. He must be manly, he must not show his tears, or he should generally behave in a particular manner very distinct from the woman or the feminine characteristics. So then she talks about how she builds